Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth and final Brody Forum of this academic year. My name is Claire Haas, and I'm this year's Brody Scholar. I want to inform all attendees that this event is being recorded. Automatic closed captioning has been enabled. Use the live transcript menu to enable this feature. Please be aware that participants may experience errors related to its accuracy, synchronicity, program completeness, and attribution. A final captioned recording will be made available on our YouTube channel after this event. Questions for our speakers can be dropped in the chat, and those questions are highly encouraged as we will rely heavily on them during the latter portion of our program. With that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to thank the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation and the Brody family for their support of Brody initiatives at the school. Norman and Florence Brody established the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation Public Policy Forum in 1996. Multiple forums are held annually at the university and in Washington, D.C., with a focus on public policy issues in the United States. Similarly, I would like to thank Dr. Betty Duke, the Brody professor, for the invaluable role she plays in planning these events, and Dean Robert Orr for his support of the Brody program. This year, the Brody Forum topics aimed to cover a trifecta of issues critical to our school, communities, and country: racism, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the US presidential election that has since passed. This year's forums featured Nike Robinson, founder and CEO of Black Girls Vote, Mr. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, and Dr. Yuval Levin, author of A Time to Build, a book on political theory and public policy. Today's forum features a discussion with SPP's own Dean Robert C. Orr and Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. They will be our main discussants, and during the latter portion of the event, we'll use audience questions to guide their conversation. So again, we encourage you to participate. Introducing our guests, I'll start with someone you may already know. Dr. Robert C. Orr serves as UMD's School of Public Policy Dean, United States Undersecretary General, and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Change. He's also a past president and current executive committee member of NASPA, the Global Association of Public Policy Affairs and Administration Schools. Prior to joining the University of Maryland, Dean Orr served as the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General from 2004 to 2014, and was the principal advisor to the Secretary General on counterterrorism, peace building, women's and children's health, sustainable energy, food and nutrition, institutional innovation, public-private partnership, and climate change. He's only done a couple of things, if you couldn't tell. Dean Orr joined the United Nations from Harvard University, where he served as the executive director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government. Prior to this, he served as director of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He has served in senior posts in the government of the United States, including deputy to the United States ambassador to the United Nations and director of global affairs at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for peacekeeping and humanitarian affairs. Dean Orr, we're grateful that you're here today. Today's special guest is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College, a clinical psychologist widely known for her expertise on race relations, and a thought leader in higher education. Her 13 years as the president of Spelman College were marked by innovation and growth, and her visionary leadership was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. The author of several books, including the best-selling Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, and Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, Dr. Tatum is a sought-after speaker on the topics of racial identity development, race and education, strategies for creating inclusive campus environments, and higher education leadership. In 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for her innovative leadership in the field. A fellow of the American Psychological Association, she was a 2014 recipient of the APA Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. A civic leader in the Atlanta community, Dr. Tatum is engaged in educational initiatives designed to expand educational opportunity for underserved students and their families. In Atlanta, she serves on many governing boards, including those of the Westside Future Fund, Achieve Atlanta, and Morehouse College. She's also on numerous other boards elsewhere. She holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, as well as an MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Over the course of her career, she has served as a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westfield State University, and Mount Holyoke College. Prior to her 2002 appointment as president of Spelman, she served as dean and acting president at Mount Holyoke College. In spring 2017, she was the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at Stanford University. Dr. Tatum, welcome to the School of Public Policy. Thank you for taking the time to join our campus community today and engage in conversation with Dean Orr. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dean Orr to commence our moderated discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Claire. That's a wonderful way to kick us off. And thank you to Betty Duke, our distinguished Brody professor, and all of the student Brody board who has put together this amazing series of conversations and lectures this year. The Brody program focuses a great deal on leadership. And it is just thrilling for me to be able to conclude our series this year with Dr. Beverly Tatum. When I think about leadership, I really think about the people who make things happen in society. And only some of those are in elected office or the kind of positions that we often think of when we talk about leadership in the classroom. The Brody series is a great opportunity for us to all explore what real leadership looks like in the flesh. And with Dr. Tatum, I think this is the perfect way to bring this year to a fitting conclusion in our study of leadership and how it relates to us and our role in the public policy world at a time of great ferment. Dr. Tatum, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Orr, and thank you to Claire for that lovely introduction. And I'm looking forward very much to our conversation about leadership and other things as well.
Fantastic. Well, I want to dive straight into that conversation, and I'm going to ask you a question that's very simple, but it's not a softball. Since we want to focus on leadership, and I've already identified you as someone who I see as a leader, when I mentioned the focus of the Brody program to you, you originally said, I'm a reluctant leader. So, Dr. Tatum, what does a reluctant leader look like, and why are you a reluctant leader?
Well, you know, I do describe myself as a reluctant leader, and the reason really is because my preference, I am an introvert by personality. My preference is to spend time by myself, and I don't necessarily seek the spotlight. When I was a faculty member, maybe I should go back even further. When I was a graduate student studying clinical psychology, I expected to be a therapist working one-on-one in a therapeutic setting, which probably would have been just fine in terms of my natural inclinations. But I had the opportunity to do some teaching, and I got excited by the classroom experience, particularly when I had the opportunity to teach about racism, which was something that happened while I was still, as they say, ABD, still working on my dissertation and as a graduate student. And when I had that teaching experience, it really shifted my desire to be in the classroom. And I pursued the academic path rather than that of a clinician. But I was very happy, you know, being a professor, teaching and reading and doing the research and living the academic life that professors enjoy. But when I had been teaching probably about 16 or 17 years, I started, by that time, I was a full professor teaching at Mount Holyoke College, and I started to feel a little restless. I had written a couple of books. My very first book was based on my dissertation, a book called Assimilation Blues. And then my second book, which is the one most people know, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, was published in 1997. And I was being invited to give a lot of talks about the book at that time. And I started to feel like I needed a new challenge. Maybe it was time to change institutions, leave a small liberal arts college, maybe pursue a Research One program where I would work with graduate students. These are the things I was thinking about. And I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, a friend, talking about my career angst, what should I do next? And she suggested that I should pursue a deanship, which was opening up at Mount Holyoke. And this kind of leadership role was not something I ever imagined wanting to do. And in fact, what I said to her was, who in her right mind would want that job? Like, it just seemed to me not at all appealing. And she said to me, you are not using your imagination. If you were the dean, you could really bring about changes in the organization, things that you've been writing about, you could put into practice. And I'd never really thought about college administration or being in that kind of administrative leadership role as something that would be interesting, much less exciting, but she persuaded me to look more closely at it. And I found at various points in my career that is what happened to me, that someone else would suggest something. You should think about being a president. You should, pursue that deanship. You should, but these were not necessarily ideas that I had on my mind without prompting. So, so that's what I mean by being reluctant. I had to be kind of tucked into it. But I will say, once having pursued those opportunities, I found that it was a good fit for me, and I could see, the value of that kind of introverted leadership, so to speak.
So just to confirm, this person who recommended that you become a dean, is she still a friend of yours?
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed. I was grateful. I have often told the story, and I should reach back and let her know that I am very grateful for that suggestion, because actually I really did enjoy being the dean much more than I might have anticipated, because what I discovered, and I'm sure you know this in your role, that there's really a lot of creative opportunity in that kind of leadership to really shape programs and begin to have an impact on an institution. And I really enjoyed that.
Fantastic. So you touched upon various aspects of your career and some of your decision making that went into those kind of key points of inflection where you may have taken off in a new direction. I'm wondering if you could reflect, as I look at your career, one of the most striking things is you have managed to move seamlessly, it would appear, between the world of ideas and the world of action. And I think that is a border that is too rigid in many, not just in many respects in the so-called real world, but also in our own minds. We think of this as an ideas job or an intellectual job, and that is a real world, a policy job. Our students, I think, transit very well usually between the world of ideas and the world of policy and roll up your sleeves and get stuff done. Could you reflect a little bit on what constructing a career that draws on the world of ideas, but also gets your hands dirty in real world problems? What have you learned from that transition and forth and back again?
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying that, I from the time I was a teenager, having read a book about a psychologist, I was interested in pursuing a career in psychology. But I was interested initially, as I mentioned, and as you know from my graduate experience, I was interested in clinical psychology, which is inherently an applied field, right? Where you're studying ideas, but applying them to people's lives. And that application was always of great interest. But when I had the opportunity to teach that first course on racism, back when I was 26 years old, just as an adjunct lecturer, sort of the trailing spouse, having followed my husband to UC Santa Barbara, and was offered that opportunity to teach the class. One of the ways the course was structured was really, it had three parts. I like to call those three parts: what, so what, and now what. And I think that for me, those are always the key questions. What is it that we're studying, that we're talking about? So what does it mean in terms of our daily lives, or how we think about, in the case of racism, what's racism? How do we understand that in terms of how it influences how we think about ourselves and other people? And then now what can we do about it? And it's probably that, the now what is the policy question, perhaps. And as I was teaching that course, when I was first learning how to do it, it became clear to me that you had to talk about the now what part, because if you didn't, if you understood what racism was, if you understood its impact, and then didn't talk about what could be done about it, your students would just leave the course depressed, that it was a problem that needed to be addressed, and we needed to think about what was each of us could think about what was our sphere of influence in terms of being able to impact a problem. Any big problem, any big thorny problem has to be broken down into pieces, I think, in manageable bites, so to speak. And what I wanted my students to do, and what I ultimately told myself to do, was to think about, what piece of this can you work on? What piece of this can you use your sphere of influence to address? And I don't know that I would have moved so seamlessly in the way that you described had I not really spent some time thinking about, what is my sphere of influence, and how can I not only use it, but also how can I expand it?
Yeah, excellent. So I noticed in the chat as we were just getting started that Curtis Valentine identified himself as a Spelman husband.
I saw that, yes.
I didn't know that I knew he was a Morehouse man. I didn't know he was a Spelman husband, but you can see the pride that comes out when the word Spelman is uttered.
Mhm.
You had a particularly important bully pulpit at Spelman because of the role of that institution in that city, in Atlanta. Can you say a little bit about, Georgia is in the news for every possible reason these days. Um, your leadership at Spelman was significant in higher education, but could you reflect a little bit on the role of Spelman and historically Black colleges in the communities around them, and helping to manage both the politics, the perceptions, and the relations in the community in which they're embedded? I'm just wondering if you could reflect on that very special institution in a city like Atlanta.
Absolutely. So Spelman was founded in 1881, which I think is important to mention in response to your question. If you think about, the burning of the city of Atlanta as part of the Civil War experience, and coming out of that, less than a generation really after the end of the Civil War, you have two women, excuse me, white women actually from Massachusetts, traveling to Atlanta with a vision of creating a school that would educate Black women, recently enslaved women, who had no other access to education, with the goal of creating leaders who would be able to uplift their communities, who would be able to provide not only education for themselves, but their children, their networks of influence. And that vision, certainly back in 1881, was a radical vision. It was modeled in some ways. The idea of Spelman was certainly inspired by the women's colleges of the Northeast. We know that looking at the journals that the founders kept, which are still, available for study in the archives at Spelman, they often referred to, creating the Mount Holyoke of the South or the Wellesley of the South, that these were ideas that they had. And I mentioned that because the idea was not just vocational training, but really, a solid liberal arts education that would prepare the next generation of leaders. And when you look at the impact of not just Spelman, of course, Morehouse as well, and the other Atlanta University Center schools, but Spelman in particular, you see women who are definitely leading in very important ways. We hear the name of Stacey Abrams, for example, a lot because of her role in um, voter election protection and turnout. And many people give her credit for turning Georgia blue in the most recent presidential election and in the Senate elections. We're very proud of the fact that Stacey Abrams is a Spelman alum. We just recently heard the announcement that Rosalind Brewer has become the CEO of Walgreens and is the only, I think, the only right now at the moment, the only Black woman to be leading a Fortune 500 company, also a Spelman graduate. There are many examples that one could point to, but particularly in the city of Atlanta, one of the things that Atlanta really is a mecca for Black talent. Many people come to attend, one of the Atlanta University Center schools. They come from all over the country and beyond the United States, but a lot of them choose to stay in Atlanta. So roughly a third of the Spelman graduates live in the metropolitan Atlanta area. So they have a tremendous impact on the economy and on the leadership within the city and beyond. And I think that example is not only true for a school like Spelman, but it's, certainly we see the impact of Howard University, for example, in Washington, D.C., and the alma mater of our first vice president, female vice president and woman of color. I myself am the child of Howard graduates, so I need to, give a shout out there. But the fact of the matter is that HBCUs have been a crucible of leadership in the United States for many generations, and that continues to be true. I used to say when I was president to the young women who wanted to attend Spelman or who were considering it, high school seniors coming to visit the campus with their parents. I used to say, there are lots of places you can get an excellent education. I myself did not attend an HBCU. I attended Wesleyan University. I certainly felt I got a good education there. But what I didn't get is what these young women will get, and that is the experience of being at the center of the educational experience in every way. And there are very few places where a young Black woman, or for that matter, a young Black man at a place like Morehouse or one of the other HBCUs, can say, this place was built for me, specifically with me and my experience in mind. And I'm going to be at the center of that education, and I'm going to see that the leaders around me are young people who look like me. And that is a very empowering experience, very empowering. And Curtis is pointing out in the chat that the current superintendent of the Atlanta Public Schools is a Spelman alumna, and she is. And I was listening to NPR recently, and I heard the name of Janelle Jones, who is recently named head of the labor division, if I'm remembering correctly, a Spelman alum who graduated while I was president, so not even that old, and having been recently appointed by President Biden to an important role as a labor economist. So this is to say, the contribution, we hit above our size for sure in terms of the leadership development that comes out of our institutions.
Yeah. I wanted one last question before turning it over to the students, because I think they have lots of questions for you. But we as a school have really been focused most intensively this past year on racism, anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and it has been quite a journey. And I think both difficult conversations, good conversations, and now we have 9 different working groups, faculty, staff, and students working together to address the issues in our own school and our own community that we've prioritized to try to address systemic racism in our midst. This is hard work. You're a
Yes.
clinical psychologist. You help people work things through. Can you give us any advice in terms of doing the personal work alongside the institutional work as we try to all become better anti-racists?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to do the personal work because it is personal. What I mean by that is we all have been impacted by the racism in our society. Sometimes we think that racism just affects people of color who are the targets of it. But in fact, all of us, everyone, is impacted by racism. And the systemic nature of it, of course, means that we are sometimes participating in it, even when we don't think we are. The policies, the practices, the procedures, the patterns of behavior that have been built up over generations persist. And even when we feel open-minded and of generous of spirit, wanting to embrace everyone, we still may, in fact, have deeply embedded in our own psyches stereotypes and biases that we're not even aware of, that play themselves out or emerge when we're least expecting it. I talk about the cultural racism, the stereotypes, the omissions, the distortions that shape our view of the world and that are influenced by the ideology of white supremacy, that when we have those influences, it's so pervasive. In my book, I use the phrase, it's like smog in the air.
Mm.
And if you live, we all breathe smog. It doesn't really matter where you live, unless you're way up in the mountains above the clouds or someplace, there's some level of air pollution no matter where you are. And if you are breathing in that smog, it is going to impact you in some way. As I like to say, if you're breathing in the smog of these stereotypes, this misinformation, sooner or later, you're going to breathe some of it out. And that is going to impact your personal relationships with other people. You may offend someone you didn't intend to offend. You may realize that you are missing important cultural knowledge that you thought you had, but you don't. And so all of us have important personal work to do. We can't always wait. In fact, we shouldn't wait, I think, to do the hard institutional work. If you wait for perfection, as I like to say, you will never get started. So understanding that we have to all lean into this work together, we have to recognize that because we're in different places in our learning journey, we may not all be speaking the same language. We may not all be using terms in the same way. We might need to spend some time defining our terms so that we're at least having a shared vocabulary. In my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, I spend a chapter talking about just definitions, defining terms, defining what do I mean by racism? How is that different from prejudice? What is the systemic nature of it? That it's not just individual acts of meanness that we are talking about, particularly in the, School of Public Policy, we can point to lots of examples of public policy that were rooted in racist ideas. And if we understand that, we know that we can have conversations about that. We can start to talk about what might need to change. But even as we are doing that, we also have to deal with our own inner anxieties about, the discomfort that comes from, am I, if I participate openly in this conversation, will I put my foot in something that I didn't intend to do? And what if I do? Then what happens? Somebody gonna, put me on social media and blast me for it? Or, can we create a space where we understand that we are all trying to learn, and we can make good use of our time together in a way that is both holding each other accountable, but also has compassion and an awareness that we are all learning here. This is a learning institution, and we're all learning.
Thank you. Your analogy of smog really resonated with me, maybe because I grew up in the Los Angeles basin in the years of pervasive smog, and it certainly affected everybody. But it's interesting, in my climate work, I have worked with governments around the world, and it takes public policy to address smog.
Yes. Yes.
It's very personal. It affects every individual. But in order to address the problem of smog, you need policy, you need political will, you need community working together through their institutions. So your analogy resonates powerfully with me, both my experience, but I really want to turn that one over in my head, because I think this relationship between the personal side of addressing racism and the institutional communal side is really where the power is at. And I think it's why this conversation today is so appreciated. Okay, Claire, I want to turn this back over to the students, because I know there are questions. I've seen a lot of good ones popping up for Dr. Tatum. So I'm going to turn this back over to you and take it away.
Delightful, thank you. Yes, there are indeed questions. So we have, I would like to kick it off with a merging, I guess, of a question that was pre-submitted and also one in the chat from Carolyn. So Carolyn asked, how do you determine the most effective way to influence your audiences when you're communicating? Essentially, how do you shift mindsets, especially because these are kind of thorny topics, or discussing race is something that often people are not very comfortable with, or some people are not very comfortable with. And I'll add to Carolyn's question, how does your training as a psychologist play into your approach, if at all? Because I think that's a fascinating angle that gives you different perspective.
Well, I'm sure my training as a psychologist does play into it. If for no other reason, just like whatever area of discipline you have been studying, you learn to think about questions in a particular way, right? So certainly one of the things that I find I have in common with historians as a psychologist is my deep belief that history matters. Right? Our personal history matters, and our collective history matters. How we think about the world is shaped by our past experiences, and so that is certainly a lens that I bring into any conversation. But when I first, as I mentioned, I started teaching about racism when I was quite young. I was 26 years old when I started that course. And I was really amazed by my students' response to the class. One of the things that struck me at the end of the semester was the feedback I got. Students wrote, I was an inexperienced teacher, so I'm not attributing this to my brilliance as an educator, right? I was new to the subject matter and new to the classroom. But at the end of the semester, students wrote things like, this course has changed my life. everyone should be required to take this class. They wrote things like, why did I have to wait until I was a senior in college to have these conversations? We should be having them in middle school and high school. You know, they were very, and most of my students at the time in my classroom were white students. I was teaching at UC Santa Barbara. Most of the students were white. And for many of them, it really was the first time that they'd really had the opportunity to have an extended conversation. And I want to emphasize the extended conversation because it was not just one afternoon and then it's over. You know, we were meeting for, in this case, they were on the quarter system, so maybe 10 weeks. But so week after week, we gathered. And if there was something that was unsettling for someone in the week before, we could revisit it in that conversation the following week. I had students keeping journals and all of that. So the idea was that the discomfort that many people experience when the conversation starts is something that you can work through over time. And what I found was that I like to call it there's the arc of discomfort. You know, when you first get started, people are excited. They think, oh gosh, this is going to be really interesting. And then it's like, oh no, I'm going to have to talk. Oh no, I'm going to have to learn some new things. Oh no, I'm going to have to challenge my assumptions. This is uncomfortable. But then you get through that uncomfortable period and then it's liberating. It's like, wow, I wasn't aware of how constricted my previous understanding was. And now I can see so much more clearly. And it is liberating is the word I want to use. And students talked about it in that way. They talked about it as energizing. They talked about it as just, you know, life-changing. And I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about why people find the conversation so energizing, to use that word. That's a word that comes up a lot when people describe how they feel about an extended learning experience of this kind. And I think it has everything to do, here's where the psychological lens comes in. I think it has everything to do with the fact that we spend a lot of energy not noticing, not paying attention, not talking. It's as though there's this big stinky elephant in the room, and we've all been trained in some way to not notice or comment on it. But yet, let's imagine there really was literally a big stinky elephant in the room, and I asked you to pretend it wasn't there. You would spend a lot of your brain width, right? A lot of your brain capacity um, trying to tune that out, trying to tune that information out. And if we think about the fact that a lot of people will say, racism doesn't exist, you know, this is not a big problem. There are certainly white people who will say that, sometimes people of color who will say that. And yet then when you help them see what is in front of them, they're like, oh my God, why didn't I see this before? That energy that they were using to not notice is all of a sudden available. You know, the bandwidth, that cognitive bandwidth becomes more available. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who invest the time find it ultimately quite empowering. But here's the but. If you only do a little bit of it, you never get to that place, right? It's kind of like, you know, taking an antibiotic. If you go to the doctor, they give you a prescription, they tell you to take it for 10 days. You know, your symptoms go away after 3 or 4. You might be tempted to stop taking the antibiotic because, you know, you don't want to take the medicine, you don't like the taste, whatever the reason. But yet, if you don't, it comes back, right? That infection comes back and it comes back worse. You've developed some resistance because you didn't do the full treatment. And I think societally, we can talk about what happens when we don't do the full treatment. You know, I think we've seen efforts in previous times in our history, we've seen efforts for people to try to really look at these issues and talk about them, but it doesn't go all the way to the end. And then there's pushback against it. And it's like, you know, we develop resistance and it comes back worse. So if you're in an environment where these conversations are happening, I would say stick with them till you get to that place where you really can see progress. Otherwise, you may find yourself just developing resistance.
That is such a helpful analogy and not one that I've heard before, and frankly, just makes intuitive sense. So thank you.
Yeah.
I wish I could dive into a million offshoots from that question, but I'll move to one from the chat because I know, and I hope they don't mind, or I hope he doesn't mind if I name drop him. We've got Dr. Carlton Green, who's one of, I believe, our UMB staff psychologists, asking in the chat, we often discuss racism as between group phenomenon. You can see the training here. Can you speak to how racial oppression can occur within groups? For instance, you help people understand how colorism and anti-Blackness can occur between and among Black people.
Sure. And I write about this in my book. I call it internalized racism or internalized oppression. You know, when I talked about the smog earlier, about the fact that we're all breathing smog, you know, the ideas of white supremacy, the ideas that, you know, in terms of colorism, for example, that, you know, lighter is better, or the ideas that we have the stereotypes that are out in the world about Black people as well as other people. When we have those stereotypes, it's not just other people. As I like to say, we all get misinformation about people different from ourselves, but we also get misinformation about people like ourselves. And to the extent that we internalize some of that misinformation, it can be manifested as colorism. It can be manifested in terms of anti-Black racism, internalizing that. But the difference between internalizing racism and the expression of racism by the dominant group, in this case, the expression of racism by white people, is that, you know, when white people are expressing racism toward people different from themselves, racially different, it is obviously problematic for the target. But when you are the target and you are internalizing racism, it's not just a problem for other people, it's also a deeply painful problem for you in terms of the self-hatred that might be reflected there, or the, you know, the negativity that's being internalized.
Thank you. And speaking to that, that negativity and difficulty of dealing with these issues, Melissa asked in the chat, often the onus of the work in organizations, and the work, I assume meaning anti-racist work, is put on the individuals who are being marginalized. What processes or structures have been successful, or I will personalize the question a little bit, have you seen be successful in creating systems or creating systemic change in educational organizations?
Well, so there's sort of two parts to this question. And the one part is, can organizations change? And have I seen organizations that have been moving in a positive direction? I have. Now, can those organizations change without relying on the voices of the groups that are marginalized within them? I have not seen them do that without the participation of the marginalized groups, so to speak. That said, it is possible for an organization to be self-conscious about not wanting to exploit the targeted groups, right? You know, so I'm going to talk about racism, but we know this could be about other isms. It could be about heterosexism or homophobia. It could be about anti-Semitism. It could be about classism as it relates to first-generation students. I mean, there are lots of different isms that could manifest. But if we're talking about racism particularly, it is often the case, you know, that people of color are asked to, you know, be on the committees, and they're already underrepresented. And so, you know, be on this committee and advise those students and, you know, do these things because we want that voice in the room, but at whose expense, right? If people are doing that work, Are they being given credit for it? Is it going to, if it's faculty members, is it going to count toward their tenure when they come up? Or are people just going to say, well, where are those articles? You know, and maybe those articles didn't get written because you were sitting on so many committees, you know, so that the kind of protection that can be put around folks who are being asked to do that kind of labor. And some people aren't even asked. Some people will volunteer. You know, I will, you know, say that I've been one of those folks who will say, yes, I want to be on that committee, you know, because I know that I've got a perspective that if I'm not in the room will not be present. So there's nothing wrong with stepping forward, but you also you don't want to be exploited, right? You want that contribution to be acknowledged and rewarded. And also you want to be in a context where an organization can say, we know we need more voices. We are going to be intentional about bringing more voices. We're not just going to wear out the voices we have. We're going to bring more voices into the conversation through recruitment. And then we're going to work on retention, and we're going to work on advancement for the members of our community who are providing such important insight into the work that we're trying to do.
Thank you. And following on that, we've got a question that was pre-submitted that, you know, one wishes that we didn't have these questions, but sometimes as a university and within any organization, you have individuals, whether students or faculty or otherwise, who don't necessarily prioritize diversity and racial equity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of something that our institution at least would like to change. At least I think I can speak on behalf of the institution in that way. I may have just crossed a line, but so in your perspective, how can universities and graduate programs shift that thinking? And then I would pose a second question, since many people kind of getting back to the intellectual versus action divide that you and Dean Orr discussed earlier. How can individuals as well, separate from their institutional role, play a part in shifting that thinking?
Well, so let me start with the latter question, then I'm going to circle back to the opening part of the question. You know, each of us has a sphere of influence, as I mentioned at the beginning. And so thinking about what is your sphere of influence, that may be an institutional role. It may be, you know, maybe you're chair of a department, or you chair a committee, or you are, you know, a faculty member who decides what's on the syllabus and what you're choosing to ask your students to read and the assignments you're giving them to do. All of that is a kind of influence. Beyond the professional, beyond the work life, there is the influence of what's going on in your neighborhood, what's happening at your kid's school, you know, what organizations are you a part of? You know, what volunteer work are you doing? There's lots of ways to think about how you as an individual, any one of us as an individual, can impact others. You know, what do you choose to study? What are you writing about? I mean, for me, the blend that Dean Orr was asking about earlier really goes back to, you know, choosing to use what I was learning in the classroom as part of my scholarship and what I chose to write about. And so the two things came together in a nice way for me. But, you know, for other people, it might not necessarily mesh in that same way, but that's important. The other thing, however, the first part of the question was, how do we get people on board who may not see the importance of it, or they maybe even actively disagree with the direction that the institution is headed, don't want to be part of the conversation or this particular effort? And so, you know, what do we do about those folks? And I get this question a lot, and I like to frame it as the, you know, you're preaching to the choir question, which is to say that there are people who will say, you know, this is the choir. The folks who logged on today wanted to hear this, you know, we're the choir. But the people who really needed to be part of this conversation didn't choose to participate. What do we do about them? I like to say, let's not worry so much about them. Let's pay attention to the fact that the choir needs rehearsal. If you think of yourself as part of the choir, the question I would ask is, how well are you singing? Are you, have you really mastered the music you're singing? If not, you could get better at it. And when the choir is singing well, when the choir is, feeling confident about speaking up in the meetings, feeling confident about, putting forward policy recommendations, when the choir has really gotten good, other people want to join the choir, right? If we think about that analogy, if you've heard a really good community choir singing, you say to yourself, that looks like fun. I wish I could sing like that. I'd like to be a part, right? When do you rehearse? Can I come? That idea that you inspire others to engage in the work with you is not insignificant, because there are always people who are standing on the edge, sort of waiting to see, is this going, what's happening here? Is this something that I want to be part of? And if they see you singing well, they do want to be part of it. There are some people who will say, not me, I don't like that song, I'm never singing it. And, I just don't want to participate. Sometimes those people are well entrenched in the organization. Maybe they are tenured, maybe they've been there a long time. But even in those cases, it is possible to sing so loudly that they don't have as much impact, right? They don't have as much impact, and the people who have become great singers become the deans. The people who have been great singers, become the leaders in the institution and really help move it forward in a way that creates a momentum of its own.
That's really wonderful. Thank you. You have brought so many wonderful metaphors to this conversation, and I so appreciate it. So your work highlights the importance of doing what we're doing today, having conversations about race.
Yes.
Do you speak to how talking about race, or sometimes not talking about race, influences people, and how you've seen that in your clinical work?
Sure. Well, I'm not going to speak about it as a clinical issue, not as a therapeutic issue, but, in a teaching way or in an administrative way. What I would say is that silence is, I started to say silence is deadly. I don't want to over exaggerate, but we can't solve a problem unless we can talk about it, right? So not talking is just perpetuating the status quo. If we want to bring about change, we have to engage in conversation. And however, it's important to say it's not just about conversation. It's conversation to lead to action, right? You have the conversation so you can take action. If we just have a great conversation and then go home and don't do anything differently, it hasn't really been effective. But when you bring people together to talk about these issues, we've already talked about the natural discomfort that comes. But if you push past that discomfort and stick with it, you will find that trust builds between the people who are participating. And as they begin to know each other better, trust each other, they start to problem solve in a way that leads to positive change. And that is ultimately where you want to go. So it's conversation in the service of action, not instead of action. And you can't really take action effectively unless there's been some conversation to start. You might, if you haven't really analyze the problem. You don't want, as they say, the paralysis of analysis. You don't want to, get stuck there, yet another study. But if you don't really know what the problem is, you can't fix it.
Amazing. Thank you. And that analysis paralysis issue falls very well on the ears of our public policy students and professors, I'm sure, who are out there listening. Shout out to the quant professors looking at you. But as we sort of move a little bit to a different topic, you originally wrote your book in 1997, Why Are All the White or Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And yet it was recently again on the bestseller list over 20 years later. And I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit, if you would be willing, on what, in your opinion, has changed or not changed in national attitudes toward racism and injustice since you first wrote your book.
Sure. Well, let's start by saying that there are 4 things that I reflect on that are sort of embedded in the new version of the book, 2017 version. I wrote a prologue for the 20th anniversary edition that was really designed to kind of reflect on what was different in that time between 1997 and 2017. And I can briefly describe what's different as what I call the 4 Ps. The first P being population change, right? The demographics. It's sometimes striking to me. I like to, date myself a little bit here. I was born in the 50s, 1954 to be precise. And in 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else. If you're a baby born today, the US population is just barely 50% white, 50% everybody else. So that's a big change, right? And so if we look at how our population has changed pretty dramatically over my lifetime, and certainly in the last 20 years, some of what we see, I think, in terms of the political shift, that is the second P, politics, is in response to that changing population. Particularly for white people who are sort of used to thinking of themselves as in the majority, the idea of perhaps no longer being in that role is for some people anxiety producing, if not outright scary. And so that I think is part of what we see being expressed in some of the regressive, what I'm going to call regressive political attitudes and behaviors happening around the country, including in my state of Georgia, where voter suppression is alive and well. So because the population's changing, you can't count on winning the election unless you suppress some of those votes, right? So that is, and we're seeing that not just in my state where I currently live, but across the nation. P, as I said, so the first P is population, the second P is politics. And in the book, I reflect on the fact that we had 4 presidents in that 20-year time period, 5 now if you count President Biden. And each one of them had sort of a different impact on how we think about race from a national leadership point of view. Bill Clinton in 1997 was actually advocating for a national conversation about race. He had launched a presidential initiative on the subject. It didn't get very much visibility or traction, in part because of other things that were happening during his presidency, including his impeachment trial. But the idea that he put forward that would be a good time for us to talk about racism and the legacy of racism in our society, he said, because at that time we were experiencing peace and we were also experiencing prosperity. And so we had the national energy to take on this hard topic. But fast forward to 2001, George W. Bush had just become president and we experienced 9/11. And then we weren't a nation feeling at peace. We were feeling under attack. And also during his tenure, we experienced the Great Recession, no longer experiencing prosperity. And then we see 2008, the election of President Barack Obama, the first Black president, of course, we know. And many people said, we don't have to talk about race now, we're post-racial, right? But of course, fast forward to even during his tenure, in fact, the day after his election, there was the greatest rise in online signups on white supremacist websites in our history, right? Was the day after President Obama was elected. So we see the pushback against that appearance of progress. And then, of course, 2016, we saw the racially polarizing rhetoric of then candidate Donald Trump and then President Donald Trump. And then fast forward, of course, to the election of President Biden. But my book ends in 2017, before his election. But the third P in this lineup is polarization. The When you ask, where are the attitudes? On the one hand, we see more progressive attitudes, particularly among young people, but it's also a more polarized time with the role of social media, I think, exacerbating some of that. And then the last P is psychology. Psychology itself has changed in terms of our understanding of concepts like stereotype threat and unconscious bias and microaggressions. These are concepts that you won't find discussed in the 1997 version of my book because psychologists weren't writing about them yet. So our understanding of how racism operates both in the interpersonal and intrapersonal is, I think, more nuanced today than it was.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our last question, if I may, before welcoming Dinor back to the stage, is one that I frankly cannot imagine a better person other than you to be answering this question. So I'm very excited to hear.
You're setting me up, Claire. Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't help it. I just fangirl over here. So what is the key for senior leaders at institutions to be effective at addressing racism and eliminating white supremacy?
Well, this is a big question, and so I think it would be foolish for me to say that someone can completely eliminate white supremacy. Even if you're doing all the things right, because it's so much a part of our cultural experience, it's sort of baked in. You can chip away at it. I think you can transform your institution. Will you have completely eliminated it? I'm not sure. I kind of like the analogy that Ibram Kendi uses in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. When the analogy he talks about is drawn from his experience as a survivor of cancer. And what he basically says is, you want to diagnose it, right? You want to diagnose the problem. So if you're a senior leader, you want to diagnose where in my institution is it lurking, right? Where are the policies, the practices, the behaviors, the patterns of behavior, where are they lurking that reinforce this idea of white supremacy, or that are actively racist, or not even actively, but embedded? Where's the racism embedded in our society, in our institution? Let's find it, and then let's cut it out, right? Let's surgically remove it, or blast it with chemotherapy. Let's try to remove it. And we will do the best we can to do that. But here's one of the things that happens, particularly in institutions. There's always an influx of newness, right? New students, new faculty, new staff. And even if somehow you had managed to change everyone's behavior through your policies and your practices, still somebody might show up and use offensive language or write a slur on somebody's door, or because you've got open boundaries, people are always coming in. So you can work very hard at it, but can you completely eliminate it? Maybe not. But you can certainly put it in remission, to borrow Ibram Kendi's analogy. You can put it in remission. And as he says, once you have restored the body to health, you have to continue to scan your environment. It's not like you can say, okay, I'm done. You got to scan to be sure it's not coming back. It's not returning. It's not, uh, metastasizing. And so that effort to recognize that this is an ongoing process, it's not one and done. We have to keep working at asking the question, who is missing from our picture? Who is feeling not included? What policies are we implementing that we then discover maybe are having disparate impact? Um, we have to be paying attention and asking those questions all the time. And to the extent that we can do that, and not just have the senior administrator do it, because senior administrators come and go, right? You want to provide leadership, but you want that leadership to filter down through the organization. So even when the head changes, those who remain are still carrying forward the work in a way that continues to create a more anti-racist, a better, more equitable environment for everyone.
Dr. Tatum, thank you. I set you up, but every time you meet the moment, and I truly appreciate it. Bringing back, if I can summon Dean Orr back to the virtual stage to close us out, I'll leave you two to it.
You can summon me anytime, Claire. It's always to something good if you're doing the summoning. Thank you. Dr. Tatum, I just realized that 70 minutes passed. This was the fastest 70 minutes I can remember in recent history. So much in here, so much to think about. And I do study people's leadership style. And I noticed one thing about yours that I'm going to publicly comment on. Some of the most fundamentally challenging things you said today were said so gracefully, so with such understanding that there is a broad audience out there that needs to enter this conversation. You invited us in even when you challenged us most fundamentally. And for that, I sincerely thank you. So I'm not even going to try to wrap this up. I want yours to be the final word here in a minute. But I do want to thank you by way of saying that you've not only given us a lot to think about, you have challenged us. I heard a number of things that we need to do and we need to get better at. And I think that was the purpose in having you come to talk with us today. You did, I loved that story of your students in your first class telling you that everyone should be required to take this course. Well, we heard that from some of our students in our undergraduate program because our examining social identity and pluralism in public policy course was so popular. They said, why isn't this required in the graduate program? We had to go through a process where we took this through the entire school, and lo and behold, it is now a required course. So there is progress. 20, 30 years later, things do change. But I want to thank you, and your analogy of the choir, like Claire, I appreciated your analogies and your metaphors because the smog one got to my policy brain, but the choir one got to my heart because this idea of singing to the choir has always bothered me. That we're just having a conversation with ourselves, and we may not be perfect, but we get it. We're working on it. But I love this idea that we have to become the best damn choir we can be, and that we can improve. And if we do, we can pull others in. And so that I take that as a friendly personal challenge that we have to be the best choir we can be. And so I just thank you for being the best guest choir director we could have hoped for today. Thank you. I would like to give you the last word to close us out.
Well, I want to really thank you for this invitation, first of all, and I want to thank Claire, who was a great moderator, as were you. So thank you both. I know that there is a lot of anxiety at this moment in our nation, right? It's not just on your campus. You know, we're all dealing with a lot of change and stress from COVID, from racism, from, you know, all the things that are happening right now. But I often think about the last book that Dr. King wrote, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote. It's titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And in the book, he talks about after every period of progress, there's pushback against that progress. But he also makes clear that it's possible to move forward again. And in some ways, it comes down to what he says in the very last lines of the book. And that's the choice that each of us makes between chaos or community. And I think at this particular moment in our national history, we can say we have seen some chaos, but we can also say we know what community can look like. And that at the end of the day, each of us can make a choice in whatever we're doing. Is this choice I'm making now going to lead to the chaos of more racism or the community of equity? And I hope that each of us will do that.